This is chapter 30. Peter stared. There had been a birch tree by the upper walls of the mill. He and his friends had named it the pirate tree because in the fall bright yellow leaves made it look like it was covered in gold coins. He tied Pax to its trunk once when the kit hadn't liked their war play. The pirate tree was still standing, but now only blackened wisps tattered its branches. Nothing else except the mill itself was recognizable. All the trees in the lower field were gone, uprooted and blasted to splintered logs. Great patches of grasses around them were scorched to ash. The bank was littered with the crow-picked remains of perch and crayfish and turtles and frogs. What hurt most was to look at the water. The last time he'd been here, he dived into the pool at the base of the gorge. The water had been so sparkling clear that he'd been able to see the pale green shafts of the reeds, the iridescent scales on the trout, and even, when he looked up, the sheer blue nets of dragonfly wings skimming the surface. He might have been swimming through liquid diamonds. Now muddy boulders clogged the river, and the pool was a dull brown ring. The broad flat of the river was half its usual breadth. Mud flats near the banks, caking to dry clay, smelled of death. The water was what the whole war was about. Peter remembered Vola asking him which side his father was fighting on. Peter had answered her, stunned that she would even have to ask. "The right side," he added indignantly. "Boy!" Vola had said, and then, "Boy!" again to make sure she had his attention. "Do you think anyone in the history of the world ever set out to fight the wrong side?" The wind picked up and howled across the fields, stirring eddies of ash. Peter had tried to imagine playing here again. It'd be a long time before anyone even wanted to play here. Vultures, wheeling silently above him, were the only living things as far as he could see. With this much devastation, they must have been feasting for days. He watched them, paralyzed by the sadness of the scene. The closest two were circling a hemlock bough near the bank, probably judging the safety of returning to the meal he had interrupted. A meal that might be. Peter couldn't form the thought, but he couldn't erase it either. If Pax had been here, he'd be dead by now. And if he was, the vultures would lead him to the proof. He hovered over 3 distinct spots, the one beside him and 2 across the river, slow and lazy. In no hurry. Their meals weren't going anywhere. He dropped his pack. Freed of the weight, he swung down to the hemlock bough in only a few steps. Trailing from beneath it was the sight he was dreading, a fox trail, its white-tipped brush unmistakable. He lifted the limb. The fox carcass had been scavenged, but its pelt remained, and it wasn't red. Oh, it wasn't red. Not Pax. He took a ragged breath. Dizzy with relief, he pegged down to the river and waded in. When he was waist high, the crutches skidded out on the mud-slimed stones, so he speared them over to the far bank and dived in. For the first time in almost 2 weeks, Peter didn't feel hampered by his broken foot. He swam strongly. He pulled himself onto the bank and out of the water. The soaked cast felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The muddy plaster already crumbling. He took his knife out of his pocket and hacked at it until he freed his foot. It hung pale and limp, but the swelling was down and the bruise was almost gone. Peter crawled up to his crutches and hitched them under his arms. Upright, he saw the larger group of vultures circling the corpse of a deer. He thought of the doe he'd seen in Vola's field. "You humans, you ruin everything," and turned away from the sight. 20 yards up the field, a single vulture hovered over the third spot he'd sighted. Peter climbed, choosing a path where the grasses had been burned, easier going. At first there seemed to be nothing on the charred ground, but when he was almost upon it, he saw a hind leg. Fleshless and singed, but he knew it was a hind leg, a slim, black-furred hind leg with a small white paw. A ragged drift of fur at the top was bright cinnamon. Fox. Peter swayed on his crutches. Maybe it wasn't Pax's. Wasn't it too small to be Pax's? He wished he could know, and he looked back with the and then he took back the wish. What did it matter anyway? A fox had been going about its life here, and some humans had obliterated that life. And wasn't that enough of an outrage? He would scrape the earth with his bare hands and bury the remains. He dropped to the ground and he swept a circle of bare rubble. And then in his hand brushed something that turned the breath to his lungs to ash, a toy soldier, sighting down the barrel of a rifle pressed tight to its hard green cheek, aiming at whatever happened to be in the way. Peter kneeled over. Pax! That's the end of 30.